Strasbourg, February 14th, 1348. 2,000 people are being marched through the streets. Men, women, children. They are not being marched to a prison. They are being marched to a building that the city council built specifically for this morning. The building is already on fire when they arrive. This is documented. A contemporary witness named Fritchie Klosner recorded it. The city's own financial ledgers recorded what happened next. The council divided the victims' property among themselves and canceled the debts the city owed to Jewish creditors. The date was not chosen randomly. The building was not an improvisation. 3 weeks before this morning, Pope Clement VI had issued a written order. He stated that Jews did not cause the plague. He ordered Christians to stop the violence. The Strasbourg City Council received that letter. They had already scheduled the executions. The Black Death killed a third of Europe. But the question history books never asked is a simple one. Who made the list of what to take afterward? To understand what happened in Strasbourg that February, and in over 200 other European cities that same year, you have to understand the world that existed before the first ship docked in Sicily in 1347. Europe, 1346. Not the Europe of ruins and superstition that gets depicted in textbooks. The Europe of 1346 is building. Gothic cathedrals rising across France and England. Trade ships moving between Sicily and the Baltic. A population of 75 million people who have not experienced a continent-wide catastrophe in living memory. It is also a Europe of precisely arranged debt. The church had declared Christian moneylending a sin. Someone still needed to lend money. To nobles, to merchants, to city councils that could not balance their budgets. Jewish communities across Europe filled that role by legal necessity, not by choice, by the specific architecture of canon law that made them both indispensable and legally unprotected. In Strasbourg, the city council carried documented debt to Jewish creditors. So did the councils of Basel, Frankfurt, Cologne. The debt records exist. They have always existed. Nobody burned them. Heinrich Truchess von Diessenhofen was a German cleric writing routine church records in 1346. Grain prices, administrative transfers, the ordinary machinery of institutional life. He had no reason to believe that what he was writing would one day be the calmest account of the worst years in European history. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. Most of the sailors were dead. The ones still alive had swellings the size of eggs on their necks and groins. The harbor master ordered the ships back out to sea immediately. The order came 4 days too late. By December, the disease was on the Italian mainland. By March 1348, it was in France. And in every city it entered, it found a society that had already decided, long before the plague arrived, exactly who could be made to disappear. Every city the plague entered, it demolished in the same sequence. First the ports, then the market districts, then the churches, because the priests kept showing up to give last rites, and the last rites kept killing the priests. Florence lost its city government entirely for 3 months in the summer of 1348. Not weakened, gone. No tax collection, no law enforcement, no one left to sign the orders. Giovanni Boccaccio survived Florence's plague year and wrote about it in the Decameron. He documented fathers who refused to visit dying sons. Not monsters, men who had watched everyone who entered a sick room fail to leave it. His tone is not dramatic. He writes it the way a man writes something he still cannot fully explain. The disease moved in 2 forms. The bubonic variant, transmitted by fleas, produced swellings in the groin and armpit, fever, blackening of the skin, death in 3 to 7 days, mortality between 30 and 60%. The pneumonic variant spread through the air, nearly 100% fatal. No swellings, just lungs that stopped working. Sicily, October 1347. Mainland Italy, January 1348. France, March. England, June. Scandinavia, 1349. It followed the trade routes exactly. The same roads and shipping lanes that carried silk and grain, now carrying something that killed 1 in 3 people who encountered it. By 1353, 25 million Europeans were dead. The flagellants appeared in 1349, groups of men marching between cities, publicly whipping themselves to appease God. The church condemned them. The marching continued. When the institution that claimed to speak for God could not stop the dying, people stopped waiting for instructions. But the plague was not the only thing moving along those trade routes. Something else was traveling with it, and it had been decided long before the first ship docked. The plague needed an explanation. Medieval authorities had two options. The first was to admit they did not know what was killing their populations, that their medicine was useless, their prayers unanswered, their institutional authority meaningless against something they could not see or name. The second was to identify a cause, something visible, something already outside the protection of the law. The well-poisoning theory emerged in early 1348. Jewish communities, the story went, had introduced plague into Christian water supplies. Medieval physicians who examined plague victims noted this was impossible. The disease killed Jews at the same rate it killed everyone else. Some said so publicly. Pope Clement VI said so in writing. On October 1st, 1348, he issued a papal bull, Quamvis Perfidium, stating explicitly that Jews could not have caused the plague, noting they were dying of it too, and ordering Christian authorities to stop the violence. He issued a second bull shortly after, reinforcing the order. The councils of Strasbourg and Basel received both letters. Here is what the financial records show. In Strasbourg, the city council carried documented outstanding debt to Jewish creditors before February 1348. After the massacre, that debt was canceled. The victims' property was distributed among council members according to a recorded schedule. In Basel, the same sequence. In Frankfurt, in Cologne. The debt ledgers and the massacre records sit in the same archives. They have always sat in the same archives. Heinrich Truchsess documented both the papal intervention and the council's response in his chronicle. He recorded the sequence, the order to stop, the decision to proceed, without commentary. He was a churchman writing in a church record. The absence of his opinion is louder than any opinion he could have offered. The Pope told them to stop. They had already counted the money. Strasbourg was not the beginning. It became the template. Within weeks of February 14, 1348, the details of what the Strasbourg Council had done and what they had received for doing it were known in cities across the Holy Roman Empire. Not as a warning, as a model. The debt cancellation had worked. The property seizure had worked. The imperial authorities had not intervened. There had been no consequences. What followed was not a wave of spontaneous mob violence. It was a replication of a documented process. In Basel, the city council ordered its Jewish population locked inside a wooden building and burned. The debt records were canceled the same week. In Freiburg, the council had Jewish residents tortured until they signed confessions stating they had poisoned wells. Those confessions, extracted under documented torture following identical leading questions in every city, were then copied and sent to other cities as legal justification for preemptive executions. Cities that had not yet experienced a single plague death used a confession extracted in another country from a person who had never visited them as grounds for massacre. Emperor Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire issued advance pardons to cities planning massacres before the massacres occurred. The pardons are in the imperial archive. He received property transfers in return. This is documented. Had Charles IV refused to issue those pardons, city councils faced execution for murder. Every council that proceeded did so knowing imperial immunity had already been granted. The violence was not despite the law, it was structured around it. Heinrich Truchsess recorded the confession extractions in his chronicle. He noted the template, the same story, the same leading questions, different cities, different prisoners. He recorded it in sequence as fact and moved on to the next entry. The machinery was now complete, and it had been built by people who knew exactly what they were building. 210 cities. That is the documented number, not an estimate, not a rough figure. 210 European cities where Jewish communities were destroyed between 1348 and 1351. The cities are named in historical records. The dates are recorded. In many cases, the council members who authorized the executions are named alongside the property they received. Worms, Germany, 1349. The Jewish community had lived there for over 400 years, since before the First Crusade. When the council's intentions became clear, they made a collective decision. They locked their own doors. They set their own fires. The Chronicle records this without elaboration. They chose their own death rather than surrender to the councils. Heinrich Truxas noted it in one sentence and continued to the next entry. Frankfurt, Cologne, Mainz. Each one a community that had existed for generations. Traders, physicians, scholars, moneylenders, families, reduced in a single organized action to a line in a financial ledger. The Cologne City Council had actually attempted to protect their Jewish population. The guilds overruled them. The guilds held debts. The guilds voted. The protection failed. Historians estimate between 100,000 and 200,000 Jewish deaths across Europe during the plague years. It is the largest mass killing in European history before the 20th century. It receives, in most history textbooks, a paragraph. By 1356, 7 years after the massacres, Emperor Charles IV began formally inviting Jewish communities back to the cities that had destroyed them. The invitation letters are in the Imperial Archive. They are written in the language of commerce. Settlement terms, tax arrangements, lending permissions reinstated. The same economic logic that produced the massacre produced the re-invitation. The cities needed lenders again. The previous lenders were ash. For 350 years, the explanation was settled. Medieval people were frightened. Medieval people were ignorant. They did not understand disease transmission. They looked for someone to blame and found the nearest available target. The massacres were the product of mass hysteria, the irrational behavior of populations under unbearable stress. This is the version in the textbooks. This is the version taught in universities. This is the version that has the advantage of making the perpetrators victims of their own irrationality, which means they cannot be held to the standard of people who knew better. There is one problem with this version. The financial records exist. In 2007, historian Samuel Cohn published a systematic analysis of massacre locations against surviving debt records across 77 documented cases. The correlation was statistically significant. Cities with documented municipal debt to Jewish creditors showed measurably higher rates of massacre severity than cities without. The debt records predicted the violence more accurately than proximity to plague deaths, more accurately than the spread of the well poisoning rumor, more accurately than any measure of popular fear. The history books called it superstition. The financial records called it a transaction. Heinrich Truxas sits in a church archive in Germany. His chronicle documents the papal order to stop. It documents the council's decision to proceed. It documents the confession extractions, the property distributions, the debt cancellations. In sequence, in his precise clerical hand, written in the weeks and months the events occurred. He was not writing an indictment, he was writing a record. The indictment was always there. It required only one thing: reading the debt ledger alongside the massacre record and being willing to accept what the sequence showed. The narrative of medieval irrationality did not write itself. It was written by the survivors, by the institutions and the families who inherited the canceled debts, the seized property, and the need for an explanation that did not implicate them. They wrote it, and for 600 years it held. The plague passed. The debt records were sealed. The narrative was written. Medieval chronicles were authored primarily by two classes of people: clergy and municipal officials. The same classes who had either participated in the persecutions, authorized them, or inherited their proceeds. The framing of mass hysteria and popular superstition did not emerge from neutral observation. It emerged from the institutions that needed an explanation which did not implicate them. Heinrich Truxas continued writing church records until his death around 1355. He had documented 2 years of massacres across German territories with the same precision he applied to grain prices and administrative transfers. Then his chronicle moved on. No reflection, no summation. The transition from massacre documentation to routine church business occupies a single line break. He documented everything. For 600 years, no one read the debt ledgers alongside what he wrote. The Reinvitation letters of 1356 are perhaps the most precise document of what had occurred. Charles IV's correspondence inviting Jewish communities back to depopulated cities contains no acknowledgement of the massacres, no language of restitution, no record that anything requiring explanation had taken place. The letters read as new commercial arrangements, lending permissions, settlement terms, tax structures, as if the prior decade had simply been an interruption. The communities that had existed in the Rhineland for 400 years, physicians, scholars, traders, families whose great-grandparents had built the same streets the councils now controlled, were gone. The cultural continuity that had survived the Crusades did not survive 3 years of organized municipal violence.
What was lost is not fully calculable. What replaced it is documented in the Reinvitation letters, a commercial relationship, restarted from zero, on terms the surviving party set alone. The archive held all of it. The question simply was never asked. The sequence has a name now: catastrophe, scapegoat, property seizure, narrative of irrational mob, historical amnesia. Historians who study the Black Death persecutions recognize it as a documented template, not a medieval aberration, but a replicable mechanism that requires only 3 conditions: an existing target population, a pre-existing financial motivation, and a catastrophe large enough to provide cover. The Black Death provided the cover. The debt records provided the motivation. The target population had been legally isolated for 2 centuries before the first ship docked in Messina. The same structural sequence appears in documented form across subsequent centuries. It does not require plague. It requires only the combination of institutional financial pressure, an available scapegoat, and authorities willing to issue the pardons in advance. The specific details change. The sequence does not. Samuel Cohn's 2007 analysis has not entered mainstream history education. The financial records are in the archives. The connection between debt ledgers and massacre severity is published in peer-reviewed scholarship. It is not taught in most classrooms, not because the evidence is disputed, but because the evidence is uncomfortable in a specific way that the mass hysteria explanation is not. The mass hysteria explanation asks nothing of the present. It places the perpetrators at a safe medieval distance, too frightened, too ignorant, too superstitious to be judged by modern standards. The financial records do not offer that distance. They describe a city council that received a written order from the highest religious authority in their world, set it aside, and proceeded according to a prearranged financial schedule.
That council did not require the 14th century to exist. It required only the conditions. Strasbourg, February 14th, 1348. The building is ash now. The date had been chosen. The council members went home that evening and recorded the property distribution in the city ledger, columns of names, figures, assets transferred. The handwriting is neat. The accounting is precise. There is no entry for what it cost. Heinrich Truxus wrote it all down. The papal order, the council's decision, the sequence of debt cancellation and property seizure that followed in city after city across Europe. He wrote it in the same hand he used for grain prices. He died around 1355 without ever receiving an explanation for what he had witnessed. His chronicle sat in a church archive for 600 years. The explanation was there the entire time. It was in the debt ledger, next to the massacre record, waiting for someone to place them side by side and ask the one question the official history never asked: who made the list?